The more I work with clients and get to know about my own journey in this path of characterological development, the more I feel just pretty intimidated by the lack of quality psychoeducation out there. It seems that one thing we should generally try to understand is our own humanity and how that can be influenced by different neurotic patterns, and more importantly, perhaps, how those can come together in social and familial, intimate, and other relationships to create systems of distortion. I like to say relational warping, oppression, subjugation, projection, abuse. I think it's too easy to accept the surface notion of humans as these rational actors that are generally aware of what makes them happy, what makes them upset, and how that fits into the worlds of other people. And obviously I may have a bit of a distorted lens, being a mental health professional that works with people through horrendous histories of unhealthy families, relationships with mentally ill people, and of the characterological struggle that each and every one of us faces to some degree or another. Maybe some people far less. But what you should know is that it's not fair to take that view for granted. There are a number of things that can happen as we're growing from being toddlers, infants, into children, and then all the stages that come after that based on what went well, what didn't go so well in those early stages of development, of learning to be a separate person in the world with access to a world of other whole people. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because sometimes what we also need to understand is what's going on with these other people. I think it's pretty clear in today's society. How are they seeing things in such a twisted way? Why is anyone defending them? So I think ultimately what I'm trying to get across is the importance of a comprehensive psychoeducation. And that's something I'd wish for the community of those of us who are privileged enough to be able to integrate these ideas in our understanding of others, and those of us privileged enough to emerge sufficiently. Or even if we haven't, I know there's some brilliant speakers out there who are themselves quite compromised. It's not terribly common, but there's a few really bright psychoanalysts that are just pieces of work. Probably Freud himself, certainly Jung, but in a way I'm a bit preferential to. And so probably the most fundamental point would be that not everybody lives in a world with self and other being separated. Particularly, there are a few defensive structures that entail compromises, ways in which we've had to dissociate and sometimes twist around our relationship to the world in order to adapt to families where the self and other differentiation isn't present for parents. I was told recently by a senior colleague that as a cognitive behavioral orientation to psychology, that this notion of putting all this responsibility on mothers is a bit distasteful. So I think that's a valid social observation. And perhaps it's why it's increasingly so rare to really encounter clinicians that are viewing mental health from the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic lens. But that being said, the primary caretaker of anyone in their first couple of years of life really is very significant. Whether that's a mother, a father, a community, the mothering role is really what matters. And so there are a number of these stages I've detailed where injuries can result in different ways in which the sense of self relates to the sense of other. We call this object relations. And when it comes to an internal representation of someone else, we say the object. So just so you know, if I mentioned that. Initially in the schizoid phase, there's a split into these part objects. Essentially two ways of being in the world, and most individuals with schizoid injuries will choose one or the other, but there's such, I have to say, there's such crappy choices that those who are lucky enough will sometimes learn how to also have an overlay of a later stage of development. Maybe it's kind of like a layer cake where you can have a schizoid with a narcissist frosting, and so long as the defenses acquired at that stage are sufficient to protect the individual from these underlying feelings of terror, rage, abandonment, persecution, estrangement, ultimate quest for a type of autonomy that's almost inhuman. So long as that narcissistic level is able to catch most of the crumbs of life stressors, well, you might not know about this other dilemma unless it manifests in a nervous breakdown. Moving forward, there's the symbiotic withdrawal, the stage of symbiotic withdrawal, the person whose caretakers are generally borderline themselves, or narcissistic in a highly in a collapsed way, generally, where essentially the fight for whose needs matter is generally won by the caretaker, and the child learns that they can be comforted, and so long as they're willing to take on guilt for being selfish, for not putting the parent first. And there's sometimes a whole lot of warping that goes on inside where there's a sense of guilt that would be more appropriately experienced as resentment to the guilty one. But any attempt to express that level of autonomy, that level of feeling of resentment for not being cared for, it's met with abuse, so the guilt is internalized. And then there's a symbiotic level where someone just simply does not learn to move out of dependency. There's the borderline, which is experiences quite a bit of this. It can manifest either in one that's more sort of attacking and demanding, and one that's just more compliant and helpless. But either way, we're dealing with someone that's not aware of other people as separate, and the notion of another being separate and not the perfect object, the perfect fused object of caretaking, it's experienced as abuse, and usually the response is to abuse those that are not complying with this. And it's such an awful way to be, that the individual that manifests this style generally has not only the original abandonment fear as so profound, but then that just gets inflamed by all the encounters with people in the world that they've abused, have turned against them. And there can be some insight into this dynamic. And the shame that accompanies it is so great that there's almost a shut-off valve where it can just be externalized to these horrible, dissociative events of expressing what we call oral rage, the rage of an infant, towards someone else for being independent of them and not being their caregiver. Similarly, then you have the narcissists, those who are successful enough to have moved into the next stage of development, where they are pushing against the world and they get to live in this nice sort of training wheels experience of being a person that's independent of the caregiver, but still very much in need of being fully held accurately by others, without the sense of there being any type of reciprocity to that, of course. So for all these stages, there's a real impairment in understanding the self is separate from others. And with the narcissist, whether it be a classical grandiose narcissist who convinces themselves that they're so great that other people just need to fully fall in line with their way of living in the world, and not acknowledge how their well-being in the world is actually dependent on convincing people to do that. In such a way, the infant is able to not really face the immaturity and the helplessness and the irritability and, frankly, the shittiness of self-centered preoccupation. And if there's a way early in life or later, say in an AA program or years of wearing through partners and really having enough integrity to try and recover, there can be a rapprochement, essentially learning how to tolerate shame. Learning how to tolerate shame without the fear that it means you're all bad and you have to project that badness onto others, in sort of this world only made for one. It's possible to grow, but that's a difficult one to grow from because it's such a robust defensive structure. And I think I'll stop the discussion at these for now, because these are those states where, in different ways, the sense of self and other are they're twisted around the axis of the psychological reality of one person rather than two. And that is, of course, really wonderful sort of foundation for creating all types of codependent or abusive or really twisted relationships with others, which sometimes could actually potentially be very healing. Maybe even joining a cult isn't such a bad thing, so long as you don't bring any children into it. But I don't recommend it. Narcissists are essentially the cult leaders of their own personalities anyway, so if you can convince someone that's dependent or borderline, and anytime they express themselves, it's fairly easy to attack them because they're acting in a way that sort of validates the assumption that anyone not accepting one's own centrality and the righteousness and maturity and greatness of one's views is always a child. Well, it helps if you're able to push the buttons of someone who then only responds in a childish way for not being parented properly. There might be a codependency there, or two narcissists who can pair up against the world as sort of a sociopathic power couple. Things aren't as easy necessarily for the schizoids. Those with the schizoid organization, without knowing it, often live in the world either as self in exile, that so beset by the enormity of the psychological worlds of others that it almost would feel like an attack that would drive them out of existence. And there are ways of, without knowing it, avoiding that human contact, or alternatively, this other dynamic, which doesn't entail being fully pushed out of the world, but where one is essentially unknown by others, one is not understood, not seen. And in order to have others in one's life, one must tolerate and be essentially subject to having to just live in the worlds of those who don't really understand them. But at least there's some level of contact. And if a narcissistic or some other type of defense can be overlaid on top of it, all the better, so as not to have to feel so submerged. And after saying all this, what I really want to get across is, rather than being surprised or insisting that someone else see it your way, when there's some degree of distortion, I mean, obviously the first place we might want to look, even if it's not always advisable, if one is the only person looking, is at one's own psychology. And for that I recommend, trying to do some good depth therapy if it's sort of hard to tease these things apart, and beware of the therapist who will collude with you and just put all the blame on the partner, but also be aware of the partner who will try and equivocate if you're in a relationship in one way or another, whether it be a parent, a boss, spouse, or even a child. Beware of the therapist who will simply try and say, well, here's what's wrong maybe with how you're approaching them. If one member or both members of the dyad are lacking this rapprochement, this differentiation, or at least lacking, in the case of the borderline, an interest in how these reactive states can actually really be abusive to others, you're not going to have a very good conversation, no matter how hard you try. And so I think it's equally valid to provide a bit of encouragement that enough effort on the part of whatever individual it is that's considering these things, that effort can be rewarded with understanding, with knowledge, and also sometimes with the healing process, or with the information that you need to leave. And no matter how hard you try, this encounter with this severely compromised individual will always turn out poorly for you, and the other person is likely to see it as your fault. There's hope. There's hope and understanding, and then there's also, in some cases, no reason to hope that all people will be able to see things on the same level. To love someone as they are is also to understand their limitations. And sometimes hate is blocked by love. And resentment, which would be appropriate, is blocked by that type of false love, because it would be too scary to feel those other feelings, because it's an act of neglect to just be seen as part of someone else's psyche. And yet that's more common than is good for all of us, and certainly more common, I think, than is recognized. So I encourage you to study these characterological styles, and I'll do my best to try and help clarify some things about them. And from there, maybe going into larger systems of oppression, larger systems of distortion. It's not always as simple as just one distortion. So hopefully together we can make sense of this world a little better, and try to spread that understanding around.